She was typing a letter when the bombs started falling. It was April 1945, and the bunker was shaking. Her name was Traudl Junge, and she was Adolf Hitler's personal secretary. In that moment, as the Russian artillery pounded the streets of Berlin above her head, she was not thinking about history or judgment or the millions who had died. She was thinking about survival. She was thinking about escape. She was thinking about what it meant to be a woman who had served a monster, and whether that service would now destroy her. This is the story that history rarely tells. Not the story of the men who gave orders, but of the women who carried them out. The secretaries who typed genocide. The nurses who cared for soldiers broken by atrocities. The women who worked in offices where evil was bureaucratized, routinized, made ordinary. They were not soldiers. They were not generals. They were just women trying to survive in a nation that had gone mad. But when the war ended, history wanted to know what happened to them. And more importantly, were they guilty? It was 1933 when the first women began to enter the machinery of the Nazi state. They came because they needed jobs. Germany was poor. The Depression had hollowed out the nation. A woman could work as a secretary, a clerk, a nurse, an administrator. It was respectable work. It paid. It was what women did. And in the beginning, most of them didn't understand what they were becoming part of. They didn't understand that they were helping to build something that would consume the entire world. The women who worked for Hitler's regime came from ordinary backgrounds. Some were educated. Some were working-class girls who had gotten a chance through the Nazi welfare state. They joined the BDM, the League of German Girls, and learned to be good German women. They learned loyalty, obedience, duty. They learned that their role was to support the men, to keep the home fires burning, to believe in the Führer. And most of them did believe. In the early years, it was easy to believe. The economy was recovering. Jobs were plentiful. Germany was strong again. But belief and ignorance are cousins. And as the machinery of the Nazi state began to grind in earnest, some of these women began to sense that something was terribly wrong. Neighbors disappeared. Laws changed. Jews were no longer allowed to work beside them, then no longer allowed to live near them, then no longer allowed to live at all. But the women who worked in the offices of power didn't see the disappearances. They saw paperwork, files, requisitions. The machinery of genocide had a bureaucratic face, and women were part of that machinery. Take Traudl Junge. She was born in 1920, in Munich. Her father was a judge. She grew up in privilege, educated, bilingual, cultured. When the war came, she was a young woman looking for work. Her skills were impeccable. Her shorthand was fast, her typing was accurate, her discretion was absolute. In 1943, she was interviewed for a position. Hitler needed secretaries. Traudl was selected. She entered the Wolfslayer, Hitler's military headquarters, and began to type the words of the man who was orchestrating the deaths of millions. She didn't know at first what she was typing. Hitler dictated to his secretaries, and they typed. Letters, orders, memoranda. Some of it was routine, some of it was not. Traudl later said that she tried not to understand what she was typing. She tried to be just fingers on a keyboard. But a woman cannot be just fingers. She was aware. She was present. She was part of the machinery, even if she told herself she was not. The women who worked closest to Hitler had a particular burden. They knew him as a man, not as a symbol. They saw his moods, his tempers, his moments of gentleness. Traudl would later describe how he could be charming in conversation, how he would talk about his dog, his paintings, his vision for the future. And in those moments, it would be easy to forget that this man had ordered the deaths of 6 million people. Easy to compartmentalize. Easy to pretend that the man she knew was not the monster history would later reveal. But there were other women whose work was more visible, more damning. There were women who worked as nurses in the euthanasia centers, the hospitals where disabled children and mentally ill adults were systematically murdered. There were women who worked in the offices that organized the deportation of Jews. There were women who worked in the camps themselves, supervising prisoners, guarding the machinery of death. Some of them were true believers. Some of them were just following orders. Most of them were both.
Dorothea Binz was a guard at Ravensbrück concentration camp. She was 23 years old when she arrived there in 1942. She was not a monster when she arrived. She was a young woman, trained by the state to see certain people as subhuman. She was given authority over women prisoners, and that authority corrupted her. Survivors would later describe her brutality, how she would beat women with a leather whip, how she seemed to take pleasure in their suffering. But Dorothea was not born cruel. She became cruel. The system made her cruel. After the war, Dorothea Binz was arrested, tried, and convicted of war crimes. She was executed in 1947. She was 28 years old. Her life story, from ordinary girl to perpetrator of atrocity to executed criminal, was shocking to many people. How could a woman become like this? What happened to the girls they had raised, the daughters of respectable families, that they could become torturers? These questions haunted post-war Germany. They haunt us still. But Dorothea's story was extreme. Most of the women who served the Nazi regime were not guards at concentration camps. Most of them were administrators, secretaries, nurses, teachers. Most of them worked in offices where the evil was distant, abstracted, turned into paperwork and statistics. Most of them could tell themselves that they were just doing their jobs. Most of them survived the war. And most of them, in the decades that followed, had to reckon with what they had done. The trials after the war focused on the men, the generals, the politicians, the architects of genocide. The women were often overlooked, sometimes excused. They were seen as victims of the system, not perpetrators. They had been under duress, the arguments went. They had been following orders. They had been powerless. And in many cases, this was true. But it was also true that some women had had choices, and they had made the wrong ones. Some had volunteered for the work. Some had been enthusiastic. Some had profited from the misery of others. Gerda Steinhoff was an educated woman who worked in the bureaucracy of the Third Reich. After the war, she was interviewed by historians and asked about her work. She said that she had not known about the Holocaust. She said that she had been kept in the dark. She said that she was just a secretary, just following orders. But when historians examined the documents she had typed, they found that she had prepared materials related to the deportation of Jews. She had known, or she had chosen not to know. The distinction seemed to matter less as the years went on. The post-war period was devastating for these women. Some were arrested and tried. Some were imprisoned. Most were released, but they carried the weight of history with them. They lived in small towns, kept their secrets, raised families. They tried to live normal lives in a nation that was trying to figure out how to be normal again. They went to church. They joined clubs. They volunteered. They tried to be good people, as if goodness after the fact could erase what they had been part of. But the past did not stay buried. In the 1970s and 1980s, as survivors began to speak, as historians began to dig, the stories of these women began to emerge, and people began to ask uncomfortable questions. If these women had known nothing, how could they have survived so long in the system? If they truly had been powerless, why had so many of them stayed? Why had they not resisted? Why had they not found ways to refuse? The answer was complicated. Some women did resist. There were women who hid Jews, who smuggled people out of camps, who risked their lives to oppose the regime. But they were rare. Most women, like most people in most circumstances, simply tried to survive. They did what they were told. They kept their heads down. They told themselves that it was not their responsibility, not their fault, not their problem. And in doing so, they became part of the machinery that killed millions. Traudl Junge lived longer than Dorothea Benz. She survived the collapse of the bunker, escaped to the west, was captured by the Russians, was released, was captured again by the Americans. She spent years in camps, in prison, in displaced persons camps. She told people she was a typist, not a Nazi. She said she was just a girl who got a job. But in her later years, she began to tell a different story. She began to acknowledge what she had seen, what she had known, what she had been part of. In a documentary filmed shortly before her death in 2002, Traudl said something remarkable. She said, "I was not forced to work for Hitler. I chose to. I was not a prisoner. I was not under duress. I was a young woman who got a job in the most powerful office in Germany, and I did that job well. I typed letters and memoranda and orders. I did not ask what they were for. I did not want to know. And that was my choice. My complicity was my choice." This confession, this moment of accountability decades after the war, was rare among the women who had served the Nazi regime. Many of them went to their graves insisting that they had done nothing wrong, that they had known nothing, that they had been powerless. The German word Mitläufertum, the crime of being a fellow traveler, of going along with the system, became a way to describe their complicity without requiring explicit guilt. But there were women who took a different path. There were women who, after the war, dedicated themselves to bearing witness. They spoke to survivors. They wrote memoirs. They tried to preserve the memories of those who had been killed. They became historians of their own time, trying to understand how ordinary people could become complicit in extraordinary evil. Some of the women who had served the Nazi regime moved to America, to South America, to Australia. They tried to start new lives in new countries, far away from the judgment of Europe. Some married, had children, built businesses. Some lived in fear of being discovered, of being brought to justice. Some, like Traudl, stayed and faced their history. And some lived long enough to see history begin to understand them differently, not as monsters, but as ordinary people who had made choices in extraordinary circumstances.
The question of what happened to the women who served Hitler cannot be answered simply. Some faced justice, some escaped, some lived long, comfortable lives, some were haunted by their past, some seemed to have felt little remorse. But what is clear is that they were not bystanders. They were not innocent. They were not victims, though some of them suffered. They were participants in a system of evil, and that participation marked them for the rest of their lives. In the decades after the war, Germany grappled with the question of how to reckon with its past. How do you heal a nation that has committed atrocity? How do you rebuild? How do you forgive? The women who had served the Nazi regime became symbols of this struggle. They embodied the question, if ordinary people can become complicit in evil, what does that say about all of us? If educated women, cultured women, women from good families could participate in genocide, could any of us be trusted? This question led to a broader examination of perpetration. Historians began to study the ordinary men and ordinary women who had made the Holocaust possible. They found that most perpetrators were not ideological fanatics. Most were ordinary people who had been socialized into the system, who had followed orders, who had told themselves stories that made their participation seem acceptable. The women were no different from the men in this regard. They had simply had different roles in the machinery of death. Traudl Junge's final years were spent speaking to schools and young people about her experience. She would show them photographs from the bunker, tell them stories about what she had seen, and then she would ask them, could this happen again? Could ordinary people like you become complicit in evil? The young people would shake their heads. No, they would say. We would resist. We would refuse. And Traudl would smile sadly and say, that's what I would have said too. The women who served Hitler died over time. They died in their sleep. They died of cancer. They died in nursing homes and hospitals. They took their secrets, their justifications, their rationalizations to the grave. Some died bitter. Some died peaceful. Some died still insisting that they had done nothing wrong. But their stories survived, and in those stories we can see ourselves reflected. We can see the ordinary human capacity for compartmentalization, for self-deception, for going along with injustice. We can see what we are capable of if we are not vigilant. The silence after war is profound. In the silence, survivors tried to rebuild, nations tried to heal,
And the women who had served the regime tried to forget, or tried to forgive themselves, or tried to understand what they had become. Some succeeded, some did not. But all of them lived with the weight of history. All of them were marked by the time in which they had lived. History does not usually remember these women. They do not appear in the textbooks. They are not honored or reviled. But their stories matter. Because in their stories, we can see the machinery of evil revealed for what it was. Not something created by monsters, but something built, brick, by ordinary people who made small choices day after day until they found themselves standing in the rubble, wondering how they had gotten here. And maybe that is the most important lesson of all, that evil does not require extraordinary people. It requires only ordinary people who are willing to go along, who are willing to follow orders, who are willing to tell themselves stories that make the unacceptable seem acceptable, who are willing to be just fingers on a keyboard, just numbers on a spreadsheet, just functionaries in a vast machine. The women who served Hitler were not monsters. They were women, and that perhaps is the most terrifying thing of all. In the end, the question is not what happened to the women who served Hitler. The question is, what would we do? If we lived in that time, in that place, under that pressure, with that fear, would we resist? Or would we, like them, try to survive? Try to be good people in a system of evil? Try to tell ourselves that we were just doing our jobs? The answer is uncomfortable, and that is why we must remember. That is why we must tell these stories, because the alternative is to forget, and forgetting is its own kind of evil. The bunker fell in 1945. The regime collapsed. The war ended. But the questions remained, and they remain still. In the silence after war, it's the whispers of women that we must listen to most carefully, because their stories remind us that evil is not distant. It is not other. It is not something that happens to other people in other places at other times. It is something that can happen to any of us, and that is why we must never stop listening. That is why we must never stop asking, what would I do? What would I choose? Who would I become?